Mickel presents Building Brands with Type by Jeremy Mickel.
Thank you, Newton and Akira, for inviting me to speak at BITS. It's really great to be here with all of you, share the stage with so many incredible colleagues, and also get to meet all these really talented designers in the Southeast Asian design community. So, I'm Jeremy Mickel. I run Mickel, a type foundry and design studio in Los Angeles. And we've published many original fonts over the last 15 plus years, including this recent release, Owners. It's a big family with 7 widths and many weights in Roman and italic styles. And it's one of our more popular typefaces. It's been used in many branding projects, including this customization that we did for Sweetgreen. It's a salad restaurant chain in the US that's become very popular. But it has a pretty humble origin. It's inspired by these signs in public parks in Los Angeles. And what I really loved about it were the inconsistencies in the way the letter forms are constructed, the super tight spacing, and also just this energy of handmade lettering, and the way that that's then applied to this signage in the international style. And you can see that's where the name Owners comes from, immediately by owners under penalty of law. And we've also collaborated with artists on open source designs like Redaction, which features many bitmap grades of the fonts. And it's available as a free download on our website. And in part because it's free, it's been used quite a bit, especially for projects with a social justice aspect. And this is intentional, because for the research on this project, we looked at the typographic legal history of typography in America, particularly the use of Times New Roman and Century, and the way these documents are processed through the courts, and interpreted that as a metaphor for the inequalities in our judicial system. But what we're probably best known for is our custom work. And we're very proud to have designed the logos and typefaces for many global brands over the years. From Adidas and Uber to Adobe and American Express, we've partnered with some of the best design agencies in the world, including Pentagram, Collins, Wolf Olins, and others. And we do it all from our little design studio in Los Angeles. From here, we work on our original typefaces, our custom projects, and we have collaborators all over the world, but this is our home base. And there's actually some foreshadowing in this image. It's not anything on the shelf or on the desk, or even this handsome little guy at the bottom, Bruno. It's this piece on the wall. It's an original painting by my friend and collaborator, Abraham Lule, but more on that in a little bit. So what I really love about custom type is that it has this very clear purpose. The client has a product, the design agency has a brief, and you are there to make their hard work possible. And every single brand has a reason to exist, something unique about them, something that you can use to build this story and use as inspiration to make the work which elevates their designs. And it's a strategy we've used over and over through the years. We created an original typeface for the upcoming LA 28 Summer Olympics, giving this bold voice to an iconic international sporting event. And the challenge of any Olympics branding is to create a design which both reflects the host city, in this case Los Angeles, and also the spirit of the global competitions themselves. And we did this by creating a family of text and display fonts that will be used on these upcoming Olympics. And this octagonal style of lettering is, of course, synonymous with the Hollywood sign, which is an iconic symbol for Los Angeles. But those shapes are also repeated in sports numerals, the work of artists like Ed Ruscha and other signage throughout the city. And we noticed an interesting detail in the original version of the Hollywood sign, where the angles in the letters diverge from each other. And this is also reminiscent of the forced perspective in much of Ruscha's work, another iconic symbol for Los Angeles. And we capitalized on that detail to build a unique story for the brand. By building references that linked these aesthetic themes of the city together, we were able to synthesize something new and get the client really excited about the story that we were trying to tell. And we used a similar approach for The Atlantic, which is a monthly magazine in the US dedicated to news, culture, and literature. It's been around since 1857. And they contacted us to design their identity, including this logo lockup among some other lockups. And we knew they were going to be using a Garamond for the text face of the magazine, so we looked at American versions of Garamond Italic from that time period to create the logo. And we also designed a typeface that would be the primary voice of the brand, something they could use for display in the magazine, giving them this wide range of styles so they could really, iterate on it over, all the different issues that they have, as well as using it for marketing, communications, social media, and the many events that they produce. And for all of this, we looked at the 1857 issues of the magazine and sourced the fonts that they were using at that time, identifying them as these American versions of Scotch Romans. And there's this naive quality to these fonts. I won't call it vernacular, Damien, but it feels special and specific. And we capitalized on those shapes to provide a unique voice for the brand. And very recently, we did something similar for the University of California, Berkeley, a premier college in the US, designing this new logo system and display typeface, which could unify all the different schools within the university. So the previous logo for the school felt very thin and overly calligraphic, and all the schools had different solution for their lockups. I won't show you because it doesn't look as good as this. It's much cleaner in this system. But the interesting opportunity with Berkeley was that it has this proud history with typography. Their logo and original typeface had actually been created by Frederick Goudy in the early 20th century. So by referencing his entire body of work, we were able to create something which kept a link to the previous design while also solving the client's issues and, most importantly, not upsetting the alumni. Which brings me to the project that I really want to talk with you about today. So Sandals is a Caribbean hotel group with properties in Jamaica, the Bahamas, Barbados, and other island locations. And I know you have your own amazing beaches and islands here in Thailand, but this is as good as it gets for us in North America. The logo you see here was designed by a great friend and mentor of mine, Ken Barber of House Industries. And don't worry, I did not try to improve it. Now, while they had a great new logo to start using, unfortunately, most of their design looked like this, which doesn't really differentiate them from any other Caribbean hotels, and it also doesn't do justice to how nice the properties actually are. So the brief for this project from Wolf Olins, our agency partner, who was designing the new identity, was to create this super family of sand, slab, and script typefaces that could be used across the entire brand online as well as at the actual, hotel locations. And the brand story they wanted to convey was let the fun of being at these properties be easy, make it relaxing, and also luxurious because they're not, they are a premium product. But they wanted to create this sense of welcoming people, making them feel comfortable and at home at their properties. So in many projects like this, there's a single image that kind of rises to the top and serves as this talisman for the entire design that we're trying to achieve. And for Sandals, this was this vintage luggage tag. And it showcases many of the elements that we knew we were going to have to incorporate into this system. There's the script logo, some informative sans serifs, a strange use of Trajan for Curacao, but also this slab serif identifying number that creates this sense of travel, a little bit of adventure and mystery. And one of my favorite parts of the design process for any of these kinds of projects is the early collection of references. I love going down rabbit holes online, scouring Google Images, Flickr, eBay, whatever you can find, to start building a story. And I found scores of these luggage tags from around the world. There was one guy in particular who had just pages and pages on Flickr, and these are just a few of my favorites. But one thing I really loved about them was noticing the printing process. And many of them were printed with flexography, which is an inexpensive way of printing that distorts the letter forms, rounding the outer shapes. And I thought this was an interesting metaphor for the beach-worn relaxation vibe that we were trying to achieve. We also looked at some handmade signage from the Caribbean. These are disco posters or hand-painted signs from Jamaica. But there was something that felt inauthentic about recreating these designs. It was too literal and not culturally sensitive. But it made me think about some other signs in Los Angeles that I've been trying to figure out how to incorporate for a long time. They're also handmade, but with a naive sense of construction. And I felt these were a better match for the kind of warm information sands that we were looking to make. There's a typographic structure here, but there's also a bit of whimsy and this, naive charm. And we also like to go to the encyclopedia, check our typographic references, but in general, I'm much more interested and inspired by typography out in the world. I think it's a more useful way to create emotional connections to the content, both for the clients that I'm working with and also the end users, the people who actually interact with the work. And I personally don't think it's helpful to go to Instagram or to other foundries' websites. That kind of thinking will only poison your design process. So from there, I isolated what I thought was the most iconic image that I had found, this shop and salon example from the signage in Los Angeles. And I collected all the images together and started building what I think of as a reference board that would serve as the inspiration for the typeface. So I'll include all of the references that or some of the references that the client shared as well, just so it feels familiar to them. I want them to know that I've been listening to them, taking their ideas into consideration as well. So that's for this sans serif that I knew we were going to be building. And then there was also the slab serif, which in some ways was more straightforward, but there was still a process and a specific story that we wanted to tell. So I started thinking about the way that this slab serif would function in the system as like a postcard sent home. And the use of the typewriter evokes this romantic sense of travel. You know, we looked at Jamaican airmail and telegrams, and the fonts in them were all fairly standard, typewriters from that time period. I knew that the sans was probably going to have some subtle rounding for that beach-worn vibe, and that we probably didn't want a true monospace. So we also looked at some 20th century faux monospace, like ITC American Typewriter and the lesser-known Remington typewriter. Again, we built a reference board which would inform the design, and with some client images in there for good measure. Now, this is, my personal opinion, and I know there are lots of benefits that variable fonts have to offer, but in my opinion, it's a good idea to deliver for your clients these very clear. Giving too many options can be a bad thing, and it can lead to confusion and muddy results. However, for designing fonts and logos and finding that Goldilocks perfect moment for the design, I find that variable fonts have become an invaluable part of our process. So these next slides are the actual variable font that I shared with Wolf Olins in our very first presentation. And for any of these things, I like to draw something that's lighter or heavier than I actually need so that I can find that exact right moment. So starting from that shop and salon specimen, I drafted a basic alphabet, tried rounding the letter forms to just, bring some of that flexography, beach quality. And then trying, going back to a lighter weight, which would work better across the entire system. And then bringing in some other ideas, like, more geometric construction to the letter forms, or playing with the aperture, how much the letter forms open on shapes like the C and the E. And then also things like, adjusting the amount of contrast in the joins. And from this simple exploration, it actually got us incredibly close to the final sans serif for sandals. The main difference is that we rounded some of the interior shapes and, of course, refined the proportions, filled out the character set, all of that. For the initial delivery to the client, there were only 2 weights, and this is the basic character set. For the slab serif, we took a similar approach, drawing a light weight and a black weight, rounding, and then, doing something a little bit less rounded, toning it down a bit, finding this more reasonable medium weight, and also looking at details like the size of the ball terminals or the overall X height. And again, we were able to get very close to the final design in that very first presentation, which doesn't happen very often. But, what I like about this workflow is that by building a story, showing your references, drawing towards those ideas, and bringing the client and the agency along for the ride, you get people invested in a concept, and it's a lot easier for them to explain it to other people and to justify the decisions. It creates a confidence and a pride in the designs that carries itself forward, and it gets the designs approved in a way that purely aesthetic solutions don't always achieve. For the sans and the slab, they're not exactly one-to-one. They're meant to be sympathetic and compatible, not just like a sans or a slab version of each other. But there are clear relationships between the stroke weight, the proportions, the constructions, but also some deviations in terms of the slab having some of these faux mono quirks and allowing the numerals to be more expressive. And at this stage in the process, we share beta fonts with the client, start collaborating on specimens, and it's incredibly helpful to see how the fonts look and feel in these layouts, even if they're speculative or just for mood. You start to get a sense for how they'll function distinctly from each other, everything from, booking your vacation, finding your way around the resort, or more important things like ordering breakfast. So that's the sans and the slab, and the trickiest part of the system I knew from the beginning was going to be the script typeface. And I was a little intimidated. First of all, I'm a huge fan of House Industries and Ken Barber, and I didn't want to do anything that would be disrespectful to his work, either by being too derivative of what he'd done, or by deviating too much, or not living up to the caliber of what he'd created. Also, I know my strengths, but also my limitations. And while I've drawn lots of script-like logos, like this for Tillamook, a ice cream and cheese company in the States, and also a hand-lettered font for Little Caesars, which I believe you have here in Thailand. And one of my earliest projects was for a little-known illustrator named Michael Beirut, maybe you've heard of him, turning his lettering into a custom font for Pentagram's nuts.com packaging. I knew that this was going to be a far more complex project and require some real lettering chops that I personally don't have. So I called in my friend and collaborator, Abraham Lule, who I hinted at earlier in the talk. And Abraham, based in New York, is a virtuosic illustrator, designer, lettering artist, and sign painter. And he can make just about anything look amazing in just about any style of lettering. So we teamed up, and Abraham immediately started doing some tests to figure out what the right kind of tools to make these letter forms might be, trying out lots of different pens, markers, brushes, and we presented these to the client, explaining the different contrast models that we were considering and testing out, a weight range before we drew too much of the digital font, testing it out in some layouts, which was promising. But when we got to digitizing the designs and sharing them with sandals, they just didn't feel sandals enough. And what went wrong? I think I was just trying to be too respectful of the logo and not make use of what was actually working there. And this typeface feels like it was made with a marker, with none of the fluidity of the brush-lettered logo. But it's okay. Not everything is as easy as the sand slab workflow that I shared. And, it's all part of the process. So we literally went back to the drawing board. Abraham got out all of his best sign painter brushes and started a new draft, which really capitalized on what the logo had to offer. This time around, we decided we weren't going to ignore it. We were going to embrace it and make the most out of it. But it was still a collaboration, a conversation between Abraham, myself, the clients. And while he delivered some amazing drawings, I still had to figure out how they would work as a typeface. I was, reworking the proportions, the design details, and so this became our process. I would digitize and revise his work, then he would give me feedback, and there were lots of questions to resolve between us and the clients. What kind of R was going to work in this font? And each of those decisions were really important because going into final production for the font, there were about 1,500 glyphs, and that's just because there are lots of alternates. To work in a script typeface, there are 7 versions of each lowercase letter, just depending on how it connects to the following glyph. So in this process, we were very methodical, thinking carefully about how the font and the logo would relate to each other. And we investigated, what is it about the logo that would need to change in order for this to function as a font? So the logo on the bottom has this very small X height, which creates this sense of drama and works great when it's gigantic. But this starts to create awkward leading in a font, so we made the X height much larger. And the logo has this dynamic rhythm which echoes the waves of the ocean, which works great in this isolated mark or when it's gigantic, but a typeface has to work at any number of letter combinations. So it was better to even out the rhythm for a more consistent texture. And the logo has these exaggerated details like sharp corners and this fluctuating baseline and these dramatic tails. And the font has much finer details in order to work in combinations at a range of sizes. So despite those differences, they're pretty convincing as a pair. They feel like the same thing. And the real benefit is that now you can type anything in the script and it's immediately branded as sandals. And you can imagine the client was pretty excited about this. So excited, they just started using it, putting the unfinished beta up on the website. That's the incorrect R in renewal, making swag for their corporate events. But, that's okay. We love the enthusiasm. And the thing is, going through that design process actually makes the work better. The brush script ended up far superior than what we started with in our first drafts. And it resulted in an asset that the client couldn't get enough of, so much so they wanted more weights of the script. So in that original brief from Wolf Olins, they'd shown us a sketch of what a script would look like in a range of weights. And I got excited about this because I thought this was an unexpected expression of how weight can work in a script. The bold weight feels like this overinflated pool toy, something I could imagine for their family-friendly properties. And the lightweight was like vinyl lettering cracking and deteriorating in the sun. So these were like emotional stories that I could get excited about. So I did some sketches based on those ideas, and Wolf Olins was really excited about this black weight. They were like, yeah, we can use that for, put it on a t-shirt or, embroider it on a hat, put it on a water bottle. The light, they were a bit more confused by, and we just couldn't really figure out where in the sandals business this was actually going to get used. And then one of their designers realized, we've been sharing all of this work with them, and the wedding group is asking, what can we use? The script that you made isn't quite delicate enough for these expensive weddings in the Caribbean, and what if we made a light that was more of a cross between like a traditional wedding script and the brush style? And so that's what we're currently working on, and you can imagine someone spending more money on their wedding, and this is kind of what helps sell that dream. And I'm excited about this because although I had earlier preconceptions about what the project might be, these start to make sense as a system, and it can also actually work for what the client needs. And ultimately, that's what's really important in a custom project like this. So the project's out in the world now. These are just some mock-ups of what the light script would look like, but everything else is out, and Wolf Woolens has launched it. They do amazing work. They've been great to work with. And custom fonts really do a lot of the heavy work in a brand identity like this. And what I love about custom type is that it really embeds the meaning, the story that we're trying to tell into the primary means of communication that gets expressed in all of these different aspects of the brand identity. And while there are lots of amazing fonts out there by people in this room, it can also be expensive and difficult to license on scale. And that's something, and that paying for that license is for something that everyone else has access to. So if you have the time and the creative resources, it can make sense to go the bespoke route because it's something that I see a lot of value in and get a lot of enjoyment out of, and I think it ends up adding a lot of bringing value and meaning to the brand at the end. So that's what I brought to share with you here today. Thank you so much, and see you around.